very pleased to be able to introduce Amy Waltz. Amy is a research ecologist, and her background is in the ecological restoration of ponderosa pine forests. And not coincidentally, she received her PhD from Northern Arizona University in biology, and her particular focus was the response of understory plants and insects to restoration in ponderosa pine. Since then, she's worked on a number of collaborative projects, one in a cost-share position between the Nature Conservancy and the Deschutes National Forest, augmenting a monitoring program and coordinating a regional collaboration effort. And building on that, her current position is Program Director of Science Outreach at the Ecological Restoration Institute in Flagstaff. And she works with stakeholder groups and management agencies to assess research gaps, as we were talking about earlier, and to accomplish research through the Institute and to develop outreach products. She's very interested in researching landscape metrics of resiliency, so obviously we'll pull her into the conference next year, and also restoration success, and I think that's sort of where today's topic heads. So Amy, without further ado, I'll go ahead and mute the participants and turn it over to you.
Okay, that sounds great. And you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great. Thank you. And if one of the participants, if you're having trouble hearing or if you have any trouble throughout the presentation, please do type something in the chat window in the lower left, and I will try to address it. And in addition, if you just have comments or questions about the presentation, you can put that in the chat window. And if it's something that's real pressing, we can address it while the presentation is going on, but otherwise we'll hold them till the end. So, Amy, the floor is yours.
Okay, and do I have the power of the presentation?
Good point, yes. Now you, thank you.
Okay, now I have the power. Thank you. Okay, so the title of my talk today, as you all know, is Impacts of Fuel Reduction Priorities on Large Wildfires, a hypothetical look at the Wallow Fire here in Arizona. And I'm going to do just a little blurb on the mission of my current organization, the Ecological Restoration Institute. And we do, in addition to the research focus, which is the majority of our work, we also develop and disseminate science to land managers and external stakeholders and do some science needs assessments. And I focus on that component because that's actually where this research question came from, or quasi-research question. And I wanted to take just a few minutes to go over this question because it's a little complicated and has a history. So the question and then modifications, we actually got this question from the stakeholder group that participates on the Forest Restoration Initiative. And it was, would large fire outcomes differ if we could magically treat all 2011 fuel reduction priorities at the national level? And that's a fairly complex question. Of course, national priorities are used for budget allocations and incorporate a lot of components, both spatial and non-spatial components. So sometimes the questions we get aren't actually well, readily answered or even appropriate. So we kind of worked with the group to modify those questions, and we came up with, can those national assessments of just fire hazard, which is a component that goes into the budget allocations, can we quantify them on a local landscape? They're not really designed for that. They're designed, of course, to try to come up with some national standardized metrics. But that was a question that was curious to our stakeholders. And then nested within that, well, how much land from those national assessments of fire hazards is still identified as a high priority for fuels reduction within designated WUI? And that's a question we hear a lot when we go out to communities. I know our Forest Service partners hear that a lot. It's basically how much more work do we need to do? And of course, we do know that trees continue to grow, litter continues to accumulate. So that's a kind of naive question as well. Finally, and what was an interesting part was, could we simulate treatments based on that high fire hazard and look at large fire outcomes? So those are kind of the questions as we modify them from that kind of larger stakeholder-driven question. I'm going to set the stage a little bit to to put some major caveats on when we try to address those questions and talk a little bit about megafires, which doesn't have a really standard definition yet, but a lot of folks have been working on that and call it uncharacteristically large or severe wildfire. And a lot of those definitions are actually related to the ability to manage or suppress. So they're more difficult to manage, suppress. A paper by Jerry Williams called them unpredictable and puts suppression efforts into more of a reactive mode than a strategic mode. But one thing to keep in mind as we try to answer some of these questions is averting megafires is not or ever will be a focus of programmatic prioritization by our federal partners. It just can't, because these are rare, unpredictable events. They're actually a very small proportion of our fire starts. And then when they do occur, the effort is always on containment, focused on our values at risk, which are our communities. So that's a good thing to keep in mind as we click through some of the analysis that we did. What are interesting about megafires to me, as we see them increasing across our western landscapes, but also globally, we're seeing an increase in these megafires, is that they can be these indicators of the climatic changes we're seeing, definitely past land management, including in this area fire exclusion, and then a general indicator of this lack of resilience that we're seeing in our fire-adapted, and particularly our frequent fire-adapted forests. Okay. This question did come up after our Wallow Fire, which occurred in 2011, and so I do want to just cover those stats again. I think this audience is fairly familiar with them. 538,000 acres burned. Of that, about 190,000 acres was in a designated community wildfire protection plan. From the ravage data, the rapid assessment vegetation severity data in 2011, about 30% is estimated to have burned in a high severity, and so that's with a greater than 70% basal area loss. 32 residences and 40 additional outbuildings burned. I think of that as actually a success story. As most of you know, this area has had the White Mountain Stewardship Project going on since 2003, 2004, with a lot of community protection around the alpine, Greer, and Nutrioso communities that saw this fire enter their perimeters. So I think this fire 10 years ago could have been even a greater tragedy. The total cost was about 109 million acres. That includes the full suppression and the first response bear. I'm checking my notes just to make sure I'm covering everything. So I'm going to set the stage, both the vegetation and the map, a little bit. This is almost the entire boundary of the Wallow, and here's my little pointer. The Wallow did burn over on this, you can see that now, western flank onto the Apache Indian Reservation, and also burned over here on the eastern flank across the New Mexico border a little bit. But for the purposes of this question, the majority of this fire did occur on the Apache Sickeries National Forest, which is in this little component of Arizona. And so we cookie cuttered out that majority of the landscape because we had a lot of the layers that we were interested in looking at for that cookie cutter approach. The hatched lines that you see on this map represent the local CWPP, Community Wildfire Protection Plans, that the Apache Sickeries National Forest incorporates into their planning. This is mapped on a vegetation layer. This is the mid-scale vegetation layer that the Region 3 developed primarily for forest plan revisions in Region 3. And what we're looking at is the existing dominant vegetation. And I threw this up there just to characterize this landscape. And the vegetation types here on the left are listed in the order of their appearance on the landscape. So the majority of the fire perimeter was a ponderosa pine mix, about half of that landscape, 263,000 acres. There were about another 100,000 acres in vegetation types that we would characterize as a mixed conifer site. And those from literature we understand to burn at perhaps longer fire return intervals. But the majority of this landscape from literature locally, we know to have burned on a fairly frequent area. So when we compare that with the data that we got from the ravaged data set, that 30% of it burned in a fairly high severity situation, we know that this was an uncharacteristically severe fire. Here's just a couple of pictures of the effects of that, showing some of those high severity effects in our ponderosa pine systems. Oops, sorry, I hit the wrong button. So we looked, to address our question, we looked a little bit of how data layers that come from our national priorities could be categorized or looked at to quantify high fire hazard acres. And we specifically looked at outputs from the fire simulator, which is part of the fire program analysis. The fire simulator is developed by Mark Finney and a lot of others, and it models large fires. Basically, some caveats for that is it looks at data that's accumulated into 270 meter pixels, and it produces multiple outputs, including burn probability, down here, and a layer that we like to call conditional probabilities of flame length at 6 different flame length categories. These are done for each fire planning unit, and I just want to point out here we grabbed this White Mountains Fire Planning Unit, which incorporates all of the Apache Sickeries National Forest, and it ends right here at the New Mexico-Arizona border, right over here. Now we initially looked at both burn probability and conditional probabilities of flame length, but we had some lessons learned in here, and one of them was that when you're looking at burn probability from our fire modeling outputs, it's really dependent on what's adjacent within your polygon that you're modeling. And if you look at this area, this particular fire planning unit incorporates a lot of topography that comes off the rim, and so it includes fuel models that are grassy, pinyon juniper, and then even kind of that Arizona chaparral. And so when you're modeling those fires, they have higher rates of spread and higher flame lengths. And when you're doing multiple fires like this, they'll come up with pretty high burn probabilities. And what we saw from this layer is this blue area, which is the very low burn probability, are actually our forested landscapes that we were interested in looking at more closely. So as a result, just to address this question, we really just focused on that conditional flame length outputs. And we used those conditional probabilities of flame lengths to create this. So this is a little diagram. There are multiple data sources going into the fire simulator. A lot of those data sources are, your basic DEMs. Land fire is used for the fuel models. And then there's multiple outputs, and I guess we lost a little bit of this in translation. Sorry for that. But of those multiple outputs, we concentrated on a set of grids, 6 grids of conditional probabilities of flame lengths. So each grid had a probability of, for this top one, a flame length of 0 to 2 feet occurring, all the way up to 12 plus. We followed some methods that Matt Thompson and Alan Ager did in one of their 2011 publications to combine that into one grid. And that's simply to take the probability from each grid times the midpoint of that flame length. And you come up with one grid layer that we call that conditional flame length. And so it's a flame length that incorporates the probability of that flame length occurring. As a result, if you look way down here at the scale looks really low. It only goes up to 6 feet plus. And I just want to make that comment. That's because it's incorporating that probability. It's different than if you were just to look at flame length outputs from one fire modeling run. Okay, so we ended up with just one layer from that FSIM output and picked, well, what would we classify as a high fire hazard area in this landscape based on that conditional flame length layer. So we just selected that very top flame length category and designated those pixels with conditional flame length greater than 6 feet as high hazard. So all of a sudden we had from our national priority set a way to quantify those acres of high fire hazard across this wallow landscape. And this is pre-wallow conditions, of course. So the next thing that we are going to do in these methods is simulate treatment of those high fire hazard priorities. So those pixels identified, and I'll just go back up, the red pixels here, what if we could magically treat them all within 1 year? That's what simulating treatment is going to be doing. We did this for 2 scenarios, and I just realized, Xander, I thought I broke up all my animation, but this is one slide that I missed. But we did a treatment scenario for treating all of those high fire hazards across the landscape, and then we cookie cuttered out and just treated the WUI. And so this map that you're seeing is just that WUI cut out with those red pixels. And there's also red pixels in the white area as well, and that would have been the landscape priority. So those are our 2 treatment scenarios. We did, to simulate these treatments of high fire hazard priorities, we took a little different stab at things, and we looked at that pre-wallow landscape with the land fire fuel models. We did do some local modifications in Region 3. That's commonly done. We can start with land fire fuel models, but based on our own local knowledge, we do some corrections for that to get a 2011 pre-wallow fuel and canopy conditions. And then we simulated a fire with the similar wallow fire conditions. And of course, I think this audience knows we didn't really simulate the wallow fire, but we simulated a fire. Then we put in these hypothetical treatments, and we're able to use in this area a lot of good work that's been done for the Fry first analysis area. Mary Latta is the fire ecologist for the Coconino, and she's assigned to the interdisciplinary team for the Fry. She did a lot of work with Neil McCusker and Mark Negrelli on that team to take those proposed treatments and crosswalk them with a little bit more specificity to some fire modeling input changes. So we grabbed a lot of her data, and I wanted to step through an example of that so you get an idea of what these treatments entailed. And so, for example, what Mary found is when she looked at pre-treatment data that maybe had a classification with a fuel model of 188, which is a long needle litter, post-treatment on that, and they modeled multiple treatments, this was the split of what could happen to those fuel models. About 18% dropped down to that grassy model, fuel model 102, 18% dropped down to 122, which is a grass shrub model, and about 11% to 182, which is a light litter. It's actually broadleaf timber, but that's one that Mary likes to use a lot. Interestingly enough, about 55% of their treatments, they actually remained unchanged, and that was just indicative of the treatment types going into Fry. We incorporated those percentages, though, so we did the same thing to our high fire hazard areas that had that fuel model 188. And there might be a lot of questions on that. It was kind of a complicated little thing, but we can definitely go back to that. Okay, so I'm going to click through some of the results, and this is just that very, very first question on the 2011 forest conditions for treatment implementation. And so this is when we looked at, I'm sorry, I feel like I missed the slide, but that's okay. Let me just click up one. No, okay. We're good. Okay, so this was that treatment implementation across the landscape. When we did that modeling for the pre-wallow landscape with those land fire modified models and other forest canopy conditions, this is what we got. We looked at the metrics of active crown fire and not the flame length, but really focused on active and passive crown fire as a metric of importance. What we found is that about 55% of the landscape was actually an active and passive crown fire. So this 285,000 acres and this 84,000 acres. This when we took those treatments, and again, this is a complicated step. Remember, we prioritized pixels from the FSIM outputs and treated those on the landscape. But we're running models with data that we got from land fire. So there might not necessarily be exact overlay, in fact I wouldn't expect it, of those high priority acres. So the first scenario that we ran is we treated all those high priority pixels identified from the FSIM output with that treatment and then ran that model again. And these are the changes that we see. So again, we looked primarily at active and passive crown fire, and we do see changes across the landscape. This is done with FlamMap, and this really isn't surprising. When you change fuel models across the landscape, you will see changes in these characteristics. So we saw, using that national prioritization, about a 40% reduction in active crown fire with the local fire run, just a 5% in the passive crown fire. Then our second scenario was done for those WUI treatments. And what we saw there is, again, is not very surprising because less of the landscape was treated. Again, we used those prioritized areas, but only in the hatch mark. And so what we found there was a 12% reduction in active crown fire and just a 3% reduction in passive crown fire. Now, what's I think is not surprising is that when you prioritize work in your WUI areas, you allow that containment for when those large fires occur there. And that's really where our priorities are, and that can be very effective. Those large fire effects, because if in this case, if we're not going into the general landscape, would remain the same. And for us at the Ecological Restoration Institute, we're interested in finding ways to quantify that, because there is potential then to lose your ecological integrity. And we're seeing that on the landscape with these post-megafire conditions, seeing type changes and areas where we're not getting tree regeneration back, or even maybe perhaps not planting success. So it's an interesting way just to look at that question. It's intuitive and it verifies what we already know about that. But it's a way for us to just kind of look at that. And, you know, Xander, this is what's funny, is that I don't remember the slide on quantifying fire hazard across the local landscape. If you'll excuse me a minute, I'm just going to click up and make sure I didn't miss something. It's like something got... Yeah, okay, so I just want to refresh us on this slide. I don't think I went through this, I don't know if I missed it the first time, so I apologize for that. I forgot to go over this table. When we looked back at that national fire assessment, I just wanted to point out that when we quantify those 6+ acres, it did identify 54,000 acres, and that's about 10% of the entire landscape. But within that, 25,000 acres were within our designated CWPP areas. And so that was an interesting thing, that it's still identifying areas within WUI. When you overlay that with our local knowledge, though, you start to understand why. And I'm just going to point out to this area in the southeast portion. That's a designated WUI area. It's also a lower elevation area. It's pin and juniper, and it drops down to some chaparral. So of course it has it can support higher flame lengths and therefore higher conditional flame lengths, and ended up being a fairly high priority. When you actually work with the forest folks, that's a lower priority for them. So I apologize for skipping back, but I did intend to cover that table, and so I'm just going to skip ahead to that conclusion slide again. Oops, there it is. So when I look at those original 3 questions, can national assessments of fire hazard be quantified on a local landscape? Well, absolutely, and it does identify about 10% of the landscape in high fire hazard. If it can be used to address those high priorities for risk reduction within WUI? Yeah, it can, and we identified of that 10%, about half of it was still in WUI. Now, of course, it's disconnected from that local data layer, the local knowledge. That second question, How do treatments of high fire hazard areas change large fire outcomes? Well, hypothetical treatments of high fire hazard areas reduce modeled severity. And again, that's something intuitive. We understood that was going to happen. There's a couple of more things that I would like to point out and open up for discussion. Definitely these caveats. National prioritizations are not intended to scale directly to regions, national forests, and/or districts. That's not what their intent is at this point in time. Also, hypothetical treatments don't take into account management designations. So that's this was a 30,000-foot look. A lot of those high priorities areas were in designations such as wilderness, others wildlife habitat. So those are locational potential barriers or just different management opportunities where we don't always go in for fuel reduction. There aren't at this time any standardized prioritization techniques across or within regions, and that's specifically because of the variability within regions and even within districts for prioritization. Socioeconomic factors play a huge role in our local prioritizations that are very difficult to replicate up to regional and national scales. There's a reason, though, what we really enjoyed looking at for this national prioritization was that there are a couple of benefits. We found this was an important component to help articulate the why here, why now question. We get this a lot in our stakeholder groups. Why are we going to this project? Why are we going here now? And some of this data is actually fairly helpful to tear down and communicate that. Or it's equally important to say the why not here and why not now, particularly in those areas of national prioritization say, here's a high fuel risk or high fire risk, but we're not going there at the local scale. This is able to kind of crosswalk and say, well, this is why, because at the local scale we have these different management designations. We had a couple of next steps that we wanted to do. Of course, FlamMap does not look at contagion, and it's just a pixel by pixel modeling. So we were going to look at different modeling tools to address some additional questions about fire spread. A couple of things that we're working on in a separate way are those local assessments of multiple values at regional and forest-wide scales. We're really fortunate to work down here, and a lot of the work that went into the forefront, including stuff done by Forest Era in the Tom Sisk lab, did some prioritization work. And we want to compare that with these national prioritization levels. We also want to continue to incorporate more local knowledge into that. Forest Era did do a lot of that local incorporation, but there's a little bit more information now available, including the high priority watershed assessments. Just for your information, in the Wallow, we're actually focusing most of our efforts on the ground treatment effectiveness, looking at a range of fire effects and outcomes in those treated areas in and around the community in different vegetation types, both ponderosa pine and mixed conifer. And that is currently in analysis. We're working on a short update for our website, and I hope that will be up by the end of the month. And then finally, I want to thank a lot of folks who helped troubleshoot these questions and also the data for it. So I just will put that up there. And I think I might have finished a little early here, but I'm ready for questions.
Great. Well, Amy, that's a fascinating look at what I've heard from folks at public meetings as well. How would this actually play out? And so it's great that you were able to take that comment from the public or a collaborator and build out a real answer rather than just something shooting from the hip. So in a second, I'll unmute the line so participants can just shout out some questions. But we had a couple questions that came in the chat box while you were talking, and one was about the true cost. So Mark Jackson was asking, what's the true cost of the Wallow Fire in terms of structure loss, rehab, tax base, wages? And I don't know if that's something that you really looked at or happen to have on the tip of your tongue.
I don't have that on the tip of my tongue. We haven't worked on that. What we have just finished here at ERI with a bunch of partners is a true cost accounting of the Schultz Fire here in Flagstaff, and I think I want to say it was about 5 times the actual suppression and bare costs. And it's so variable, as you all know, from fire to fire. I wouldn't just throw that number out there. They incorporated the loss to the water resources on the Schultz fire, the loss to property, and we unfortunately lost the life to the post-fire flooding on that fire. So that working paper will be out on ERI's website too. It's a great question and a lot of interest in that, particularly at our congressional levels. So I'm sorry I don't have an answer at the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, and that's obviously fair. I mean, that's a pretty in-depth question in and of itself. So we have some other questions. Dana, well, maybe more a comment about the pre-wallow. The burn probability in most of the wallow area was relatively low, and I don't know if you want to comment on that, Amy, and maybe put that in context.
No, I agree. That's what we saw too with even some of our modeling, and I think that I don't know how to put that in context, and actually maybe we can unmute it for Dana to put it in context a little bit. It's definitely what we're seeing with mega fires. Just kind of an unpredictable fire behavior that is out of kind of the context of what we can model. And of course, modeling is not real, but I don't know if Dana would have some more thoughts on that.
Okay, let me go ahead and unmute the line. So I don't know, Dana, if you want to type something in or shout out, sort of expand on that idea a little bit.
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, and also I see that Dan Mendar's participating, and Dan was a big part of the Alpine Ranger District for many years, and it once again shows that you can model it, but as you're saying, it's a mega fire. It was kind of the perfect storm. You take into consideration the fire regime and condition class. A lot of that burned the way it's supposed to burn, stand replacement, mixed conifer. It happened at a very much larger scale than what we could have ever dreamed of. And fortunately, a lot of those WUI treatments on the south end of Alpine were a huge part in reducing the fire behavior before it hit the community. On the other hand, on that east side of Greer, in that WUI, but also, there's spotted owls, and everything wants to live in Greer. People, critters, you name it. And even with the treatments that had been done on the east side, the convective heat literally just kind of baked those trees in place. So it's just kind of always interesting to, what the model shows and then what really happens. So that's why I just threw that comment out there, that it was, overall the probability was low, but that doesn't mean when it does happen, it's going to be a low severity, minimal impact fire.
That's a great point. There's no particular link between the probability and other fire characteristics like flame length or severity.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
And maybe we could turn to Tim's question about whether you thought about a causal relationship to the WUI mitigation and the lower effectiveness on length reduction in comparison to the landscape mitigation. And Tim, you may have to, I may not have done your question justice, so if you want to reframe that, please do.
No, you're fine.
Well, and I think if I understand it, I can easily start stepping in doo-doo here, because this is where this project, it's a modeling question, and we are, our treatments impacted inputs to a fire model that we knew how it would affect the outcome. So you're talking about how did our treatments, why did it impact the flame length differently from the landscape scenarios to the WUI scenarios? Is that how I understand that?
That's.
Yeah. And honestly, it was that change to fuel models which correlate exactly to how it's modeling those average flame lengths. And the difference between the WUI and the landscape is just we weren't affecting as much of the landscape. And that's where I really think, FlamMap isn't really the right tool. I think we can use different tools that incorporate those adjacency changes. So if you're treating over here and your winds are out of the southwest, then you do have changes in things like flame length and also crowning activity downwind from those activities, and that would be a better way to get at those landscape changes and any impact that WUI treatments could potentially have across the whole landscape. That seems like a roundabout way. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
That did answer it. The next question to go with that was what's your WUI and landscape cross-sectional area model parameters were?
So do you mean like the WUI was about 190,000 acres and the landscape we modeled was 514,000 acres? Is that?
No. The cross-sectional area per acre at the mitigation level.
Really?
Huh. Cross-sectional area.
When we mitigate, for instance, in WUI areas in New Mexico where I'm situated, we shoot for a cross-sectional area of about 40 square feet per acre as a density for trees.
Oh, gotcha. We didn't incorporate that into these models. It's a much more coarser scale than that. So I can't answer that question for you. I don't think we addressed it at that scale.
Okay. At some point, that would be good to have.
Yeah. Thank you.
On trips and all that, maybe as a follow-up, as a way to kind of get towards Tim's question about the remaining basal area, can you, Amy, jump back to I think you described this early on, the treatments, the sort of prescription.
Yeah, this one?
Yeah, so maybe just describing those proposed treatments for the fry in a little more detail, or reminding us.
Right, and I just gave this example for fuel model, which doesn't impact flame length and things like that, but there are, of course, other variables that we modified go into FlamMap, including crown bulk density and canopy cover and crown base height. So, but these treatments were typical of either restoration or fire risk reduction. And so we modified, they were modeled with FVS, and based on FVS outputs, which do suggest a fuel model, but Mary actually just took straight outputs of stand density and other characteristics and actually created her own crosswalk for those different attributes of fuel model, crown base height, and crown bulk density. So that was the system that we used. I just followed Mary's protocol, made it a little bit more coarse because, of course, we were doing this on a pixel-by-pixel basis and didn't have actual stand prescriptions that varied across the landscape.
And I guess just to push this issue a little farther, while it may not have come through in the modeling, I know you know a lot about what happens on the fry, and for those of us who aren't as familiar, can you describe sort of the kinds of treatments, maybe sort of typical, or if there is such a thing, on the restoration side as well as the wildfire mitigation kind of treatment?
Well, yeah, in general, they're mostly the thinning from below. Region 3 has long dealt with the 16-inch diameter, and fry in particular wanted to tackle that issue. So they have a large tree retention strategy that they're using instead. But the majority of the treatments are really focused on those trees that are less than 16 inches that have most of them developed since fire exclusion. It's really the bulk of the uncharacteristic conditions in these forests. Fry is also predominantly focused on ponderosa pine. So when we looked at these areas that showed high fire hazard from the national prioritization, some of them fell in mixed conifer. And so we actually used Mary's help, but she hadn't developed those crosswalk or when fuel models differed into what I would call those higher elevation systems. And so we did a similar crosswalk for them. Those aren't being tackled by FORFRI in this current first analysis area, which is called the ponderosa pine. So is that enough level of detail, or we're also going for the spatial stuff, which I think is difficult to prescribe, and I think Neil's done a great job in this draft EIS out there to get what we like to call the patchy, groupy, clumpy systems down there. That's very difficult to model in fire. In fact, Mary spent a lot of time. We are talking about a pixel by pixel set of criteria, and but what we find, of course, when we're on the landscape, that fuel model of grassy timber is actually divided into a nice patch of trees and a pretty big open grass area. It's going to burn way differently than what we're modeling. Those are model limitations, and folks a lot smarter than me are working on ways to try to incorporate those kind of patchy systems that we're hoping to recreate on the landscape.
That's a great point, I know, and this, I think, comes up in mixed conifer as well, where as we think of what I refer to as more creative treatments, beyond just sort of a strict 16-foot spacing, but the spatial distribution of trees being clumpy or patchy or putting things, suddenly the fire models need to catch up, and I feel like that's a good area for research. Turning to another question from Tim, how did you see the modeling behavior connect or correlate with actual mitigation results? So obviously you modeled some treatments in some areas that actually experienced the Wallow Fire, and did it make you feel good that the modeling results showed the same kind of change in fire behavior that you can now go and see on the landscape?
Yeah, it did, and what was interesting, and I think it's hard to for me to clearly articulate, is we were treating pixels based on the FSIM output, but still showing with our own FlamMap outputs those changes on the landscape. FSIM and our stuff both used land fire for inputs to those initial fire priorities, but there was a lot of other stuff that goes into the FSIM output. So I was actually really pleased how that national priority tiered down, and so when we only treated those pixels identified from the national priority, our local modeling efforts showed those significant changes. So the pixels were tearing down is what I'm trying to say. And yeah, I'm just clicking through these slides right now, and it doesn't look like a large proportion of the landscape, but this is the precondition, and when we treat the landscape, you see a lot of reduction down here. Hannigan Meadow, of course, is where the fire started, the Wallow Fire started, and there's a lot of wilderness there. It doesn't mean we would necessarily go in there to treat, but that's where we're seeing the reductions. And then when we treated all those red pixels on this landscape, so you're also seeing the reductions in the WUI. And then when you click and just do the WUI treatment, of course, those landscape level high fire hazard areas stay high, but you start to see the WUI reductions a little bit. So Tim, I did feel like it tracked very well, and what was interesting to me was the FSIM outputs compared to our local modeling.
That's always comforting to feel like that the model seems to jive with reality, so that's good. I did want to break in. I just put in the chat window, at the end of this webinar, you'll be redirected to a survey, but if you're jumping off early, please go ahead and fill out that survey, and we'll remind you again in the follow-up email. But it's always good to get feedback both on the content and ideas for future webinars, as well as things we could have done better. Are there other questions out there? Here, great. Mark has one here, and he asks whether you, Amy, have compared the White Mount Apache forest to the remaining Wallow burned area.
No, I haven't. That would be interesting to do, yeah. They've done more treatments over there, so anecdotally, I've heard that it has a lower severity. Is that correct? Can you confirm that?
Yes, I can confirm that its severity was quite limited.
Yeah, yeah.
That's one of my soapboxes is often that we don't look enough to tribal forest management for lessons learned and ways of dealing with some of our problems on other lands that maybe they're tackling more effectively. Other questions out there? Other comments? Well, maybe while people are thinking of questions, Amy, I'll take this opportunity to thank you. This is a fascinating study, and I think you guys have done a great job, and I really appreciate you presenting today. You really covered a fairly complex topic in a way that was easy to understand, so thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to hear that. I was actually a little nervous about that. Thanks.
Other questions out there? Well, maybe if we've no reason to keep folks on the line, if we've exhausted the topic, we will, as I say, send out a follow-up email. And Amy, if you have any resources or when you do have the final report on this, we can share that as well with participants.
Okay. That sounds great. I'll keep you informed, Xander.
Okay, great. Well, and thanks again to all the participants. And please do check back in next month. We'll have another webinar, and you know, it's a nice way to spend our lunch hour. And so I thank you for joining me. So with that, I'll go ahead and close off the webinar. You'll be redirected to the survey, and I'll close off the phone line as well. So thank you all.